Okay, so today's topic, going to have a sort of a bit of a look at process maturity and the importance of process maturity. So, a couple of things I want to go through. What do we mean by process maturity? Why do we need it, or how does it help us? I'm going to go through a few different topics around that. And then the last thing I want to look at is what I've called here, how do we progress? But basically, it's all about, okay, once we understand what we're talking about in terms of process maturity, how do we progress up the scale, essentially become more mature, if you like. So what is process maturity? Process maturity is all about the extent to which the organization, and when I say the organization, I mean all the people within the organization, the extent to which they understand how the organization operates. And why that's important is because me as an individual working within an organization, I might come in every day and do the same things every day or every week. But if I want to change or improve anything, I have to have a level of awareness about what's happening around me before I change anything. Okay, so I might look at a task that I'm doing thinking, great, I could make that much faster, so I'll save myself a bit of time. But without that awareness of what's happening next, or indeed what's coming into me, or even after the next person that I hand over to, I've got just as much chance of breaking something in the organization or making something a lot worse further down the line than I have of actually improving the way that things work. So process maturity is all about how organizations understand or have the tools to be able to understand or raise that awareness of the wider organization for everybody within it. And obviously, when we use the term process maturity, we're talking about process. So processes describe all the work that happens within the organization. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have documented every single thing that happens in the organization, but we have to have documented enough so that we can understand how all the different pieces work and fit together. We're also not, there's not an expectation that everybody in the organization has to understand how everything else works, but you need to be able to navigate that information and be able to read it, to be able to use it to, as I said, make changes, make improvements, or indeed even just detect that something isn't working right. And I'm sure most of you have been in these situations where you can do the same thing in a business for years and years and years without realizing that it's broken or it's a problem. Okay, until something else happens and impacts you and highlights that potential issue. So in order to help us understand, so if maturity, the process maturity is all about that awareness of how the organization works and tools which help us understand how the organization works around us, then we can build and use models to help us understand what the maturity is within the organization today. And so that's what I've got on the screen here. This is a model that we use at Skore. I would like to say, I'll stop short of saying it's a model we've developed. It's actually based on a well-known model called CMMI, or Capability Maturity Model. But again, it has its roots in exactly the same things that we're talking about here. And all we've done is we've taken that and we've changed the language a little bit to try and make it a bit more user-friendly, in the same vein that we try to simplify how things work at Skore. And so what the model allows us to do is to be able to look at us, look at our organization and try to understand where we are today, but also to help us try to think about where we want to get to as an organization. For a very sort of broad stroke here when I talk about the organization. Okay, so the organization could be the whole business, or it might be a business unit, or it could even be down to individual teams and departments. So from years of using this to help understand organizations, how they're operating, it's it's quite normal that different parts of an organization will be at different levels of maturity at the same time, and that in itself is quite valuable, because that might help understand why sometimes when you do something in your part of the organization and you get frustrated with another, it might be because they're at different maturity levels and so on. But let me just quickly give a quick overview. I know it's on the screen already, but what these different levels are. So the bottom level we talk about, number one, is we call it unstructured, and that's generally where you've got an organization where there's no processes documented, or no documentation describing how the organization works, or there may be documentation, but it's very, very detailed. It's difficult to use. It might be perfect for the one person that uses it on a daily basis, but others might find it difficult to use. When we move to level two, we talk about tactical. Tactical is where there is some effort going on within the organization to document processes, or has been documented, but it tends to be focused on specific problems or specific projects within the organization. So it's not thinking more widely about how the different parts of the organization fit together. And so it might be that you're doing some sort of small project around a system that's very specific to one department, for example. You might be looking at processes for that. When we move up to the strategic level, that's where we are starting to then think about documenting how the organization works at a level above that, so we can start to see how processes within different teams actually start to interact with each other. So at that point, you're starting to build a holistic model of how the organization works. We can still see this in a lot of organizations, but it can be quite technical. It might be very architectural driven, and therefore sort of difficult for people to understand. But it's still a valuable tool, because again, it's giving somebody that overall picture of how the different pieces fit together. And again, you might see that in a larger systems type implementation, where you've got a system that's touching different parts of the organization, like an ERP type project. So somebody has got to try and understand how all those bits fit together. Generally, when you're moving into that strategic level, processes are being documented proactively. So in the tactical level, things are only being documented when they're needed, i.e., as I said before, when there's a specific problem that needs to be addressed, or a specific project that needs to be delivered. When you move to strategic, then the organization is proactively documenting stuff. So it's still mostly going to be prioritized by problem areas and projects and so on. But generally, there is an ambition that we need to understand how all of it fits together. When we move to embedded, that's when we're starting to think about who owns these processes. Are they fully aware of their roles and responsibilities within that ownership role? So who owns a specific process, and do they understand their accountability for the output of that process and delivering the value to the customer that process delivers? To really drive that ownership and accountability, you need to understand, as I said, the value of those processes, but also be measuring them to ensure that they are, or maybe not, delivering that value. Processes should be visible to everybody at that point, but it may just be like a point of reference that someone might need to go and look at every now and again. Level 5, which we've called agile and resilient, I think some of the other models actually call it continuously improved, for example. That's all about where you're really getting the whole organization, so everyone in it, to start thinking about, how do I continuously improve the way that we work within the organization? So if you go back to what I said before about this, it's about raising this awareness or understanding for everyone in the organization about what's happening around them. That's what all the levels leading up to this are about. It's about building that model that allows us to have that awareness, so that when we get to level 5, people across the organization can then start contributing. They've got a platform, a framework in which they can then communicate issues they see on a day-to-day basis, problems they find within the process, and then a nice simple way for them to explain that to others, so that they can be addressed. Even just trying to understand the scale of a particular challenge or issue. So if it's something small, can I fix it today with minimal impact on those around me and the rest of the process? Like, do I understand enough about the process that actually I'm just going to change that thing and get on with it, and it will make a difference? Or is it a bigger problem and I actually need to bring other people in, or the company needs to assign a team to go and address this particular issue? But again, having that awareness empowers people in the organization to be able to say those sorts of things, have those types of conversations, and understand the impact of what they're doing. One of the things that we often get approached by organizations who are looking to establish process documentation or build a process library as a if you like, a user manual for the business. So they want to establish a manual, like a place where people can go to say, this is how I can go and ask a question, how do I do X? Which is really useful. Obviously, the benefit of having that sort of level of documentation means you can have a higher level of confidence that people are doing things in a consistent way. The challenge with that approach is actually trying to get people to actually use the documentation and remember it's there. Because if it's something that you don't do very often, and someone comes along and says, can you do this thing, you might not even be aware the documentation's there for you to go and get it. The second challenge with that is actually trying to keep that documentation up to date and relevant all the time. So while it's a great goal to have that level of documentation, it's quite difficult to maintain. Following this approach and actually making the goal not about having a documentation, but having a culture and an approach around continuous improvement actually solves those problems. Because what happens is what you need to think about is, how do I put in place a process or an approach where people regularly stop and say, okay, what hasn't worked well for this process since the last time we reviewed it? What would we do differently, or what should we do differently? So starting to put in very simple routines, regular routines. And when I say regular, I'm not talking about daily or even weekly. In some cases they will be. So approaches like agile software development, they will often have a daily or even a weekly review, what they might call a retrospective. Okay, what didn't work so well in the last week? What should we do different next week? But a lot of processors will still benefit from that hugely, doing it once a month, even once a quarter. And it's about getting into that habit, because that does a couple of things. One, as soon as someone recognizes something isn't working properly or comes up with a suggestion to improve it, you're updating the documentation and you're keeping it up to date. At the same time, you're reminding people about what's there, where it is, and what's in it. So it becomes then second nature for people to actually then use and address that documentation. So actually, that having that approach, because that user manual almost becomes a sort of byproduct of that continuous improvement level. I'm just going to pose a couple of ways of how we might use the model. So talked a bit about helping us understand where we are within the organization and where we need to get to. But a couple of things just worth thinking about here. So first point I've got here is different levels help us achieve different things. So, it's an ideal to be able to move up to the level 5 and have the continuously improved organization. But it's not always essential for all, not all teams or organizations feel that they need to get that. And there are benefits from getting to specific levels, if that's all you need to do. In fact, I mentioned before in the examples, if all you're doing or all you need to do is implement a system that's very localized to a certain part of the organization, you can legitimately ask yourself, do I need all the other stuff to go around it? Equally, you can think about, well, getting to level 5 is a long-term goal. That's a 3 to 4 year project, but we have some issues that we need to deal with now. So what's the level we need to be at to be able to deal with that issue? Like I said, if you're then looking at a system or a change within the business that is touching multiple departments, you really then start to be needing to document the next level, and so on. Having the maturity model then helps us define our strategy to get there. So if we want to get to that level 5, it helps us to do that. So it helps us to understand, first of all, where we are today, so you can make an assessment of where your particular team or organization is today. You can have an informed discussion about where you want to get to, or realistically where you're going to get to within a given time frame. And then from that, you can start to plan, right? How are we actually going to do it? What are the things we're going to do to help us move from where we are today to the level we want to get to? My recommendation of helping organizations through this is always about making sure that you are really established at the level you are, that if you assess yourself and you think, hey, we're at this level, first thing is make sure you're really established at that level, and then start to plan one level at a time. How do we move to the next level? Consolidate that effort and then start planning to the next level as well. Sometimes you might find it goes quite quickly, other times you'll find areas might be challenging. And again, going back to what I said before, not every team or department within an organization will move at the same speed, or will indeed be at the same maturity level. So you have to sort of take those things into consideration at the same time. The last point I wanted to make on here is that the model also helps us understand what we need to measure right now. So I'll go into this, and I'll show a little example of this in a second, but I'm specifically thinking about where are we within the model? What do we measure to make sure that we are consolidating our position at a certain level, or what should we be measuring to make sure we move to the next level? And it can help us do that. So what I'm going to do is just show you the last. I'm going to show you a bit more on the metrics in a second, but the last point that I wanted to sort of cover quickly was, how do we progress? Okay, so we know what the maturity model is. We know how it helps the organization. We can work out where we are, and we can work out where we want to get to. So how do we actually progress with that? So like anything, there's a plan behind it. What we can provide at Skore is, we have built a model which we've shared previously, and is certainly have it available to share with users today, what we call the Centre of Excellence model. So Centre of Excellence model it's all about how do you build the capability within your organization in order to deliver this, in order to build these and travel up these levels of maturity. So it's about, what are the team, what are the roles and responsibilities you need in place, what are the systems you need, the data, and so on. So there's a sort of model that we have pulled together, as I said, which we can share. So what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to go into the whole model. It's quite a big piece and there's lots in there, but I'm just going to pick a couple of bits of it to share with you now. So one of the sections we have in the model is all around vision and strategy. So how do you set the vision and define the strategy for what you do? And here's just a quick section from that. So again, you'll recognize the model here as we move up through the levels. And then at a very high level, we define some of the activities that you would do, as I said, to solidify your sort of position in that particular level. So again, if we're talking about the tactical, it's about identifying the specific processes that are causing you a pain in the business. So remember, because it's tactical, you focus on specific projects. It's about training a core group of people who can go and capture those processes, and engaging with the specific stakeholders that are impacted. When you move into the strategic level and start to do that, you then start to think about, how do I define the process at architectural level, the whole organization, so I can start to see how things fit in. As you move up, you'll start to be doing things like, how do we identify the process owners and train the process up? Process owners up. How do we talk about this role called process champions? So these are often the sort of right-hand person of the process owners. They're the ones that are collecting feedback, making sure that processes are updated, and so on, right through to how do we embed those routines around continuous improvement. So we talk about creating and maintaining a review calendar, for example. All of the things that we put in here are all tools that we that are either embedded within the Skore platform, or we have templates and so on that we can provide and how to do that. And then the last bit I want to do is just also from our Centre of Excellence model. I have just a quick section about the metrics and measures as well. So again, I mentioned this just before. As you move from one level, there are different things that are important to measure. So this is not designed to be an exhaustive list, but again, just to provide some ideas about different things that you might want to measure. So again, down at the tactical level, when you're looking at very specific things, it's understanding what is the value of the improvement that we're able to make at that point. When we move into the strategic, I mentioned before, that's all about proactively going out and documenting the organization. So it's about measuring the number of processes captured or the percentage of processes. You've identified a list of processes, what's the percentage you've captured? As we move into embedded, it's starting to think about, have we identified process owners for everyone? Have the processes been published? Have we identified measures for those processes? And here we talk about KPIs and PPIs. So KPIs, key performance indicators, are what is the value that the process is delivering. So for example, if it's the sales process, the KPI will be something like contract value, for example, that you're producing from sales, whereas PPI is process performance indicator, and that's more about understanding the adherence to the process. If you've defined a process, how do you know that people in the organization are following the process as designed? And so that's about looking at things you can measure, which are often quite simple, things you can measure to make sure that people are following the process. And that's important, because if you've defined a process and you've defined a KPI, if that KPI changes, i.e. the number goes up or goes down, you need to have a good degree of confidence that it was impacted by a change you made to the process. And if you don't know how closely people are following that process, and you've got no idea whether the process is the problem or something else is the problem. So the PPI, or the process performance indicators, give you that level of confidence that when your changes to the process are what's impacting your measures. And I think at that point, I'm going to stop there. So there's a very quick overview of what is the process maturity model, things it can be used for, and some examples of activities and measures to help progress up through the maturity levels. So can you remind us what's the next week?
So next week on the 29th of March, next week's drop-in session will be using custom forms for compliance, and that will be with Colin. So look forward to that.
Thank you again, and look forward to seeing you again in a future session.